Hi guys and welcome to Calm Night Radio Channel. Tonight we slip into a Mississippi winter night in 1845 where the fields lie pale under a strange dusting of snow and the dark cabins at the edge of the plantation glow like low lanterns against the cold. What did it feel like to cross that frozen yard, to carry the day's exhaustion into a room built by rough hands, and to find warmth in a place the world never meant to be gentle? There is a quiet surprise here, because winter in Mississippi is not supposed to look like this, and yet the air bites, the ground hardens, and the people inside those cabins know exactly what must be done. So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and while you're getting comfortable, comment below with your location and your local time, because nothing feels stranger and sweeter than sharing a night story across different corners of the darkened world. Now, dim the lights. You step into the evening as the last grey light thins across the plantation. The snow is not deep, not the grand northern sort that swallows roads and fences, but a thin, stubborn cover that has turned the ground bright and unfamiliar. It clings to the frozen ruts between buildings. It rests on split rails. It powders the roofs of cabins and the bare branches of trees. Mississippi does get snow on rare occasions, though not often enough to make it ordinary, and the sight gives the land a hushed, almost confused expression. Even the dogs seem less certain. Your shoes press into a crust of frost and damp earth. The cold climbs through the soles. Each breath feels sharper than you expected, with the smell of wet wood, chimney smoke, and distant livestock hanging in the air. The day has been long. Winter labour still works the body hard, even when the crops are not rising green and thick. Fences must be mended, animals fed, tools maintained, timber cut, cotton ginned, corn ground, water hauled, ashes carried, clothing patched, children minded. There is no season when labour suddenly becomes polite and decides to leave people alone. History is rude like that. Ahead of you, the row of quarters stands near the edge of the cultivated land. Some plantations in Mississippi kept cabins arranged in clear lines, almost military in their order, while others let them gather in looser clusters depending on the terrain, the owner's preferences, or simple convenience. These dwellings were usually built from logs or rough planks, sometimes with mud chinking pushed into gaps, sometimes with brick chimneys if the plantation was wealthy enough, and sometimes with little more than a patched opening to let smoke and heat bargain with each other. Historians agree on the broad outline of these cabins, but they still debate how much variation existed from one plantation to another, because surviving descriptions often come from planters who preferred self-praise to accuracy, or from memories recorded many years later. As you walk closer, you hear the small evening sounds gathering in layers. A child coughs somewhere behind a wall. Someone knocks ice from a bucket. A hinge groans. A woman calls softly for a boy to come inside. From one chimney, smoke rises in a dark ribbon and then bends low under the weight of the cold air. From another cabin comes a quick burst of laughter, brief and bright, like sparks leaping from a fire. It vanishes at once. Laughter does not need much room. It can live in a crack. The courtyard smells of ash, damp wool, and trampled straw. A few hens have settled themselves into unreasonable places, looking offended by the weather as if winter were a personal insult. You pass stacked firewood cut to uneven lengths. Every piece matters tonight. The search for fuel was constant on many plantations, and enslaved people often gathered wood under strict limits, even though the cold did not care about rules made by men in warm coats. A strange little truth lingers in plantation records. Owners sometimes counted blankets and shoes with great seriousness, yet rarely counted comfort. They listed bodies, tools, barrels, mules, but not tenderness, not fear, not the relief of reaching a door before your fingers went numb. You reach the cabin and pause for a moment outside. The wall is rough under your palm, the wood ridged and cold, with old splinters raised by years of weather. Clay filling the gaps has hardened in some places and cracked in others. Near the threshold, the snow has melted to a slick patch from many feet going in and out. Warmth leaks faintly through the seams, carrying the smell of cornmeal, smoke, and wool that has dried too many times by the fire. It is not the sweet scent of comfort from a storybook cottage. It is sharper, earthier, mixed with sweat and iron and old boards, yet against the frozen air it feels almost luxurious. When the door opens, the heat meets you in a soft, smoky wave. Not hot, never that, but enough to loosen the face and neck, enough to let your shoulders drop. You step inside and blink while your eyes adjust to the firelight. The room is small, lower than you imagined, with shadows gathered in the corners and every useful thing placed close because space does not permit carelessness. The floor is packed dirt in some cabins, rough planks in others. Here it is hard underfoot and scattered with bits of straw and tracked mud. A few stools stand near the hearth. A table, plain and scarred, leans slightly to one side. Pegs on the wall hold garments that are drying or waiting for morning. A blanket hangs as a divider, giving the hopeful impression of separate spaces. The fire speaks in a low crackle from the hearth. It burns inside a simple fireplace where flames lean around blackened logs in a bed of glowing coals. The chimney does its best, though not perfectly. Smoke sometimes curls back into the room, especially when wind presses in the wrong direction. Your eyes sting for a moment. Above the fire hangs an iron pot, dark with use. Beside it sits a smaller vessel, dented and reliable. Cast iron is one of those quiet heroes of the 19th century. It appears in kitchens, camps, cabins, and every place where people must turn almost nothing into something edible. It is never glamorous. It just keeps showing up. The people inside make space without wasting words. Coats or shawls are shifted. A child is guided aside. Someone lifts a bundle from a stool so you can sit. The warmth is strongest near the hearth, and the whole room seems arranged around that fact. You can feel the heat on your shins while your back remains cool. One side of you believes in winter. The other begins to forget. Your hands move toward the fire almost automatically. Fingers spread, palms prickling as feeling returns. Light trembles over the walls. You notice how the cabin has been made livable by effort so constant it almost becomes invisible. Cracks are stuffed with rags. A corner has been lined with extra straw to block drafts. Bedding is rolled or folded where it can stay dry. A broken handle has been repaired with wire. Nothing here is casual. Every object has been asked to last longer than it should. Every useful scrap has won a second life. That practical art of survival filled plantation quarters everywhere. Enslaved families and individuals often built, patched, cleaned, and improved their own dwellings as best they could, even though the cabins themselves belonged to the system that held them captive. Warmth had to be made with intelligence, not granted with kindness. You listen as the room settles into its evening rhythm. The pot gives off a steady simmer. Someone shakes snow from a cloth near the door. A wooden spoon taps once against iron. Near the hearth, a pair of shoes has been turned on their sides to dry, their leather stiff and tired. A child leans against an older woman's leg and stares into the fire with the total seriousness only children can give to flames. Somewhere under the scent of smoke, you catch a trace of sweet potatoes and maybe onions, softened low and slow. The smell is humble, but it fills the air with promise. There is talk now, quiet and layered. Not one grand conversation, but several small ones crossing each other. A man mentions ice in the water bucket. A woman answers that the washline froze hard by afternoon. Someone mutters that the wind has come down from the river. Another person says snow at night often makes the morning look cleaner than the day deserves. That sounds like a proverb, or perhaps just a tired thought dressed nicely. In places like this, speech often worked in two directions at once. Ordinary words carried ordinary meaning, and then something deeper slipped beneath them. You notice clothing drying close to the fire. Carefully close, not foolishly close. Shirts of coarse cloth, a child's small garment turned inside out. Wool, if anyone is lucky enough to have it, holds the smoke smell for days. Textile records from the period show that enslaved people were often issued simple clothing of coarse cotton or woolen material depending on season and plantation budget. though the quantity and quality varied wildly. Some owners bragged about winter provisions, while formerly enslaved people later recalled garments so thin and worn that body heat mattered more than fabric. Scholars still disagree about how typical the better accounts were, because planters preserved receipts and letters, but not the full truth of how long a shirt lasted when you worked in it 6 days a week and slept in it at night. One of the more curious tidbits from prairie life is how often settlers describe the weather as if it had intentions. Diaries speak of storms stalking the plains or cold slipping through cracks like a thief. It sounds poetic now, but it was probably just accurate enough to feel worth writing down. When the wind can flatten crops, lose cattle, and freeze water solid overnight, it stops feeling like a background condition and starts acting like another resident of the place. A very unpleasant resident, never pays rent, constantly rattles the windows. The central mystery begins with this simple fact. Some Sumerian texts seem aware that human life is fragile, that cities collapse, and that knowledge can vanish unless someone prepares for its survival. They do not state this in one clean sentence. Ancient records rarely behave so politely. Instead, the idea appears in scattered pieces, in laments for ruined cities, in lists of kings from impossibly remote times, in flood traditions where chosen survivors carry memory into a broken world. The wind presses softly at the wall. The chimney answers with a low murmur. Your feet slowly thaw. The room glows. The night has only begun. You begin to notice the cabin not as a single room, but as a set of careful decisions holding back the cold. At first glance it seems simple, almost blunt in its construction, as if it were thrown together by haste and habit. But winter teaches the eye to slow down. The wall nearest you is made of rough boards, uneven at the seams, their grain raised by damp seasons and summer heat. The boards do not meet perfectly. They never did. Thin slivers of darkness remain in the joints, and in daylight those cracks would show threads of the world outside. On a night like this, every gap matters. Someone has pressed clay into the wider openings, now dried into a pale crust. In other places, there is a mix of mud and straw, kneaded by hand and packed into the spaces where air would otherwise slide through. This chinking has split in places, and the cracks inside the cracks have been filled again with scraps of cloth, twists of paper, or handfuls of fibre that look like old moss. The work is not elegant. It does not need to be. It only needs to stand between sleeping bodies and the hard edge of winter. You reach out and touch the wall with your fingertips. The wood is colder than the room, but not icy. It has that dry, tired feel of boards that have been heated and cooled 1,000 times. Dust clings to the ridges. Here and there you feel the slight softness of cloth shoved into a seam, making the whole wall feel patched like a coat repaired too often. The cabin itself has become a garment. It has to wear winter as best it can. This kind of repair was common in plantation quarters throughout the American South. Enslaved people often maintained the cabins they lived in, using whatever materials were available or quietly scavenged. Owners might provide logs, boards, or nails in some cases, especially when new quarters were built, but day to day upkeep often fell to the people inside. The official story, when it was written by planters, usually made such cabins sound sturdier than they felt on a wet January evening. The difference between a neat description and a human night could be the width of a finger laid against a draft. The door is another lesson in compromise. It hangs on iron hinges that complain every time it moves, and its planks fit together with only moderate confidence. Along the lower edge, a folded strip of cloth has been tucked to keep out the worst of the creeping air. Near the latch, where wood has worn away from years of use, someone has stuffed a small wad of rag into the shallow depression. It is a tiny act of resistance, almost laughably small. Yet winter is defeated by ridiculous little victories. One rag, one handful of clay, one extra board set against the wind. Human history contains empires, battles, speeches, and grand monuments. It also contains people kneeling by a draughty door, telling the cold that it can come in less quickly. Above you, the roof contributes its own uncertain promises. The underside is dark with soot in places, especially near the chimney line. The boards overhead are not smooth. They rise and dip, making shallow shadows where spider webs catch faint firelight. A few strips of fabric hang from pegs or nails near the rafters, perhaps to dry, perhaps to stay out of the reach of children, perhaps because there is nowhere else to put them. The roof does not inspire complete faith. In rain, it probably ticks and leaks. In wind, it likely mutters. But tonight it holds. Some Mississippi slave quarters had stick and mud chimneys, while others had brick chimneys or wooden chimneys lined with clay. Depending on local resources and the wealth of the planter, brick was more durable and safer, but not every plantation spent generously on enslaved housing. To put it mildly, fires were always a danger in small cabins packed with bedding, clothing, straw, and tired people. Historians still dispute how often quarters burned compared with other plantation buildings, because the records are uneven and often more attentive to property loss than human terror. Even so, the fear of sparks must have lived close to the hearth on winter nights. The chimney here is broad enough to draw a decent fire, though the smoke can be stubborn. Soot has climbed the surrounding wall in a dark fan. A line of warmth radiates outward from the bricks and clay, fading a little more with each foot of distance. The room teaches you its own geography, close to the hearth. Your skin loosens and your fingers move easily. Near the walls, the air sharpens. In the corners, chill settles like a second kind of shadow. Sleeping places have been chosen with this map in mind. At one side of the room stands a low bedstead made of plain wood. It is not large. Its rope support has sagged slightly with use, and over it lies a corn shuck mattress covered by cloth that has been washed so often it has given up trying to feel new. Corn shucks, when dried and packed, make a rustling mattress that shifts and crackles beneath the body. They are not soft in the luxurious sense. They are simply there, a lifted place above the floor, warmer than bare boards and drier than earth. Some cabins held bed frames, while others relied on pallets laid down at night. The arrangements depended on family size, available materials, and the unromantic mathematics of poverty. The smell of the bedding is warm and layered. Smoke, wool, skin, old straw, maybe lye soap faintly clinging from an earlier washing. It is the smell of things lived in thoroughly. A folded blanket rests at the foot, thin in places, thicker where it has been doubled or patched. Another cover has been pieced together from several fabrics that do not match. One square is darker. One is almost smooth from wear. One bit appears to have begun life as part of a shirt. Looking at it, you understand that cloth never truly retired here. It merely changed jobs. A wooden chest sits against the wall, its lid scarred by use. The chest probably stores the family's most necessary belongings, or at least the ones that must be kept dry and out of the dirt. A Sunday garment, perhaps, extra cloth, a Bible on plantations where reading was allowed or secretly pursued, sewing things, small valuables that are not valuable to a ledger, but priceless inside a room, needles, buttons, a scrap of ribbon, a pipe, a letter, if fortune has been unusually bold. Such items transformed a cabin from mere shelter into a place where people asserted identity under crushing limits. Even a chest could serve as quiet proof that a life contained more than labour. Near the hearth, you see a broom made from bundled twigs or broom corn. The floor around it has been swept recently. Not perfectly, because perfection is what idle people demand of others, and no one here is idle. But swept enough to create order, dirt remains. So do ash and bits of straw. Still, there is intention in the space. Domestic order inside slave quarters mattered deeply, not because it erased hardship, but because it made daily life more manageable and self-directed where possible. Travellers and visitors sometimes remarked with surprise on the tidiness of such interiors, as if they had expected deprivation to produce carelessness. That reaction says much more about the visitor than the room. The window, if it deserves the name, is little more than an opening shuttered against the night. Some cabins had glass panes. Many did not. Here the opening is covered tightly, perhaps with a wooden shutter, perhaps with cloth or paper reinforced against the frame. Cold still sneaks around it. When the wind shifts, You feel a faint thread of moving air against your cheek. The person seated closest reaches up now and then to press the covering more firmly into place. This is not the sort of gesture a history book usually records. It should. You look toward the corner where cooking things are kept. A few bowls, not matching, a wooden ladle, an iron spoon, maybe a small skillet, a gourd vessel, perhaps a crock or jar with something stored inside, protected as best it can be from damp and mice. Kitchens on plantations were often separate structures for the main house, but the quarters depended on cabin hearths for much of everyday cooking and heating. That meant smoke, soot, and food were woven into the same air that people slept in. A modern person might complain at once. Your eyes water a little. Your nose stings. Then the heat reaches your knees again, and the complaint fades. There is a faint sweetness beneath the smoke, coming from dried corn hanging or stacked nearby. Cornmeal was a staple ration on many plantations, often supplemented by pork, molasses, sweet potatoes, greens, or whatever people could grow, hunt, fish, or trade for themselves. Small garden plots, when allowed, could make a meaningful difference. So could chickens. So could luck. Though luck is a thin supper. A fringe but revealing detail appears in scattered plantation recollections. Some enslaved people lined cracks in walls with old newspaper when they could get it, turning cast-off print into insulation. Imagine that for a moment. The public words of the wider world, flattened and tucked into a wall to stop the cold from entering. A newspaper finally made useful. The cabin's interior has another quality that slowly emerges as your eyes adjust. It is not only a place of necessity, it is also shaped by taste. On a peg hangs a cloth chosen not just for use, but because its colour pleases somebody. Near the chest rests a small object carved or smoothed by hand. Perhaps a toy, perhaps simply a bit of wood worked into a satisfying shape. A cup has been placed carefully rather than shoved aside. A blanket has been folded with neat edges. These are tiny decisions, but they soften the room. They insist that human beings lived here, not merely bodies stored for work. The walls catch the firelight unevenly, so that every repair shows itself in a slightly different tone. Clay looks pale gold. Old rags appear brown or grey. The boards flash honey-coloured where the flame is strongest, then sink back into umber shadow. The effect is almost beautiful, though beauty here is a careful word. Nothing in this room has been made easy by beauty. Still, the eye finds it. The rough surfaces glow. The patches make a pattern. The whole cabin seems to breathe as the fire shifts. A child runs a finger through a seam in the floor or along the edge of the hearthstone, then withdraws the hand quickly from a grown-up's warning glance. There is no extra room for foolishness, yet children make games from almost anything. Perhaps the cracks in the wall become rivers, perhaps the knots in the wood become faces. One former account from plantation life describes children treating frost traced inside a window opening as if it were lace. That image feels almost too delicate for the setting, and maybe that is exactly why it survives. Hardship does not erase wonder, it just makes wonder stranger. The cabin is warmer now that the door has stayed shut for a while. The air feels thicker, touched by breath and steam and smoke. Your face is warm on one side, your ankles are still cool. The fabric at your shoulder holds the smell of the room already, as if you have been absorbed into it. You understand now that shelter here is not a fixed thing. It is made every hour. The walls alone do not protect anyone. Protection comes from tending the fire, sealing the cracks, drying the blankets, arranging the bedding, sharing the heat, and knowing exactly where the cold is trying to enter. That is the real architecture of this place. Not boards, not nails, not clay. Attention. Attention turned into survival, again and again, under a winter sky that has laid rare snow over Mississippi ground. Outside, the cabin looks small against the dark. Inside, every inch has been argued into usefulness. The room holds because human hands have taught it how. The fire becomes the centre of everything without asking permission. No one in the cabin needs to announce its importance. The room has already bent around it in a quiet circle of habit. Heat gathers there first, then light. Then the small evening work that must be finished before sleep can take hold. You settle closer to the hearth and feel the bricks give back a steady warmth. Not fierce, not wasteful, just enough to make winter loosen its grip by degrees. The logs burn with a patient sound. It is not the theatrical crack and roar of a great bonfire. It is a lower music, a conversation of coals, sap, ash, and settling wood. Now and then a knot pops softly. A thin orange line opens along one log and brightens, then folds inward as the timber sinks into itself. The scent is dense and familiar, half comfort, half labour. You smell oak smoke, old soot, damp bark steaming dry, and the faint metallic breath of heated iron. The air by the fire feels thicker than the rest of the room, almost textured, and when you hold out your hands, your skin prickles at once. Above the flames, the iron pot hangs from a hook blackened by years of smoke. Its round belly catches the light in dull patches, revealing scratches, grease sheen, and the pale crust of starch dried near the rim. It has likely cooked the same narrow range of foods 100 different ways, each one an act of resourcefulness disguised as supper. Inside tonight, something simple bubbles slowly. You can hear the little wet knocks of simmering against the pot's inner wall. Cornmeal, perhaps, stirred into mush or pone, maybe beans, maybe a piece of pork lending flavour more than fullness, maybe sweet potatoes broken down into softness. The smell says warmth before it says plenty. A woman stands near the hearth with a wooden spoon in hand, stirring in a motion so practised it seems to come from the shoulder, not the wrist. She does not waste effort. Every turn of the spoon is even. Every scrape along the bottom is deliberate. Food must be watched closely when there is little to spare, and an iron pot will punish distraction without mercy. Burnt supper means wasted fuel, wasted time, and one more evening made harder than it already was. History often admires the grand engineer, the battlefield commander, the orator in a fine coat. Yet here is another kind of mastery, quieter and more useful tonight, which is the art of keeping supper from scorching while children hover and smoke stings your eyes. Near the hearthstone, a smaller vessel sits close enough to warm but not boil. Water inside has begun to steam faintly. It may be for washing a face, easing a cough, softening something dried and stiff, or simply making tomorrow's work less brutal. Warm water in winter is never a trivial thing. It is a mercy created by timing. Someone thought ahead. Someone placed it there while doing 3 other tasks at once. The cabin is full of such invisible intelligence. Your feet stretch toward the fire until the chill leaves your toes in slow increments. The leather of nearby shoes gives off a damp smell as it dries. They have been set on their sides, then turned again, so that no part sits too close and hardens or cracks. The shoes look tired enough to deserve a prayer. Their seams are worn. One lace has been replaced with a strip of cloth. Mud from the yard clings in the grooves. Good footwear was precious and often scarce among enslaved people, especially for children, who might go barefoot much of the year and only partly shod in colder months depending on the plantation. Winter made every weakness in clothing plain. A hole stopped being an inconvenience and became a wind. Beside the shoes lies a pair of stockings, or what remains of them, stretched near the warmth to dry. They are coarse, mended at the heel, and still dark with damp. A child reaches toward them absently and is gently redirected away from the hottest part of the hearth. Children learn quickly where not to put hands. Fire warms, cooks, dries, and threatens in equal measure. It has no polite manners. The people around it must supply those. The room now fills with the rhythm of shared evening tasks. One person bends to split kindling into thinner pieces for later, striking carefully so the blows stay controlled indoors. Another wipes a spoon clean and sets out bowls. A young girl rubs at a wet patch on a garment hung close by, checking whether it has nearly dried. An older man rolls his shoulders as if trying to persuade the day's stiffness to leave him before sleep. The soundscape is modest but rich. Spoon on iron, cloth wrung once, wood set down, a cough, low talk, the whisper of boiling, the small living noises of people refusing to let a room go slack. The smell deepens as supper nears readiness. You catch sweetness from sweet potato skins, or perhaps roasted cornmeal browning at the edges of a cake near the coals. Smoke lays itself over everything, of course. Smoke is the cabin's stubborn perfume. It settles into hair, blankets, rafters, skin, and memory. Yet within it you can separate other notes if you pay attention. Grease, onion, damp wool steaming from a shawl turned toward the heat. The earthy scent of clay near the hearth where boots have tracked in moisture and warmth has pulled it back out again. Even the iron has a smell, especially when heated. It is mineral, sharp, almost like pennies and rain. Enslaved families often depended on rationed food distributed by plantation owners, commonly cornmeal and pork, though local practice varied widely, and many supplemented those rations through gardens, hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering, or trading when possible. Some planters recorded rations with almost theatrical pride, as if listing pounds of meal could settle the moral question. It could not. The gap between ration and nourishment was often bridged by the labour and ingenuity of the enslaved themselves. Historians continue to argue about how much autonomy people had in food production on different plantations, because evidence varies from county to county, and from one owner's rules to the next. What nobody disputes is that the evening meal had to be stretched, seasoned, guarded, and made meaningful with skill. A flat iron lid rests near the fire, and beside it a hoe with its blade cleaned and repurposed for cooking. In some southern quarters, hoe cakes were baked on heated metal, or directly on the hearth using whatever flat surface could serve. The name sounds almost comic now, as if dinner had borrowed a farm tool and forgotten to give it back, but there is a blunt elegance to such improvisation. Tools changed jobs when they had to. So did people. So did scraps of wood and fragments of cloth and cracked bowls still capable of holding one more supper. A child waits with extraordinary seriousness for the first portion to be served. Hunger can make anyone ceremonial. His eyes stay on the pot as though it contains the answer to a question nobody else has solved. Another child has grown drowsy and leans sideways against an older woman's leg, lulled by heat and the soft repetition of voices. She strokes the child's hair without looking down, her hand moving from pure habit. The gesture lasts only a moment each time, but it keeps happening. Small touch, small reassurance, small anchor. The firelight changes faces. That is one of its strange powers. Wrinkles deepen and soften by turns. Eyes brighten, then retreat into shadow. Hands look older near the flame, their knuckles thrown into relief, the skin dry from work and weather. You watch a pair of hands lift the pot slightly to settle its position, and you notice old burns, pale lines, thickened places, nails shortened by use. Those hands have cut, lifted, hauled, washed, patched, stirred, soothed, and endured. In plantation records, a person might be reduced to age, sex, price, field hand, seamstress, child, cook. But hands tell a longer truth. Someone uses tongs or a stick to shift a log inward, and a brief constellation of spark spins up the chimney throat. Everyone's eyes move there for a second. Then the sparks vanish and the log settles with a sigh. Fire in a small room commands attention because it must. No one can afford carelessness. A blanket hanging too close, a child stumbling, a coal rolling unseen. Any of it could turn the cabin from refuge into danger. There are accounts from the 19th century of quarters catching fire from hearth accidents, chimney floors, or fallen embers. Such incidents were surely underreported unless they threatened plantation property beyond the cabins themselves. It is one more cruel pattern of the archive. Flames become noteworthy when wood is lost, less so when fear is. The woman at the pot now dips the spoon and tests the texture, then nods to herself. Bowls are brought forward. The first servings are modest, but the smell alone lifts something in the room. Supper does not transform the cabin into abundance. It does something more realistic and, in its way, more moving. It steadies people. It gives them a warm thing to hold. It fills the mouth with salt and starch and steam. It tells the body that for this moment, at least, it will not be left empty. You take in the details of how heat is used with near-scientific care. Wet garments are moved from one peg to another depending on how close they can safely go. A child's small shoes are turned once more to prevent scorching. A brick or stone near the hearth may be warmed for later use at bedding. A kettle, if there is one, is set not in the hottest place but where it can slowly gather warmth. Nothing here is casual. The fire is both servant and tyrant. It must be fed, managed, watched, and thanked without ever using the word thank. A curious tidbit survives in a few recollections from enslaved communities and southern rural households alike. People sometimes banked the fire at night by covering the coals with ash, so that a faint core of heat would survive until morning, sparing them the misery of striking a new fire from complete cold. There is something almost tender in that image, a fire put to bed so it may wake with the household. Whether every cabin could manage this consistently depended on fuel, hearth design, and sheer luck, but the practice speaks to a truth deeper than technique. Morning always arrived too soon. Anything that made dawn less harsh mattered. At last the bowls are passed around. Steam rises in pale ribbons, twisting through the smoky air. People eat carefully because hot food in cold weather demands patience. A child forgets this, blows too quickly, and draws a quiet laugh from the others. Not a loud laugh. Nothing raucous, just a brief easing in the room. Even humour seems to warm the place by a degree. As the meal begins, the fire continues its patient work. It dries what can be dried. It softens stiff hands. It keeps the room from surrendering to the white cold pressing outside. The iron pot swings slightly as it is emptied, creaking faintly on its hook. Ash gathers at the edge of the hearth. The cabin smells of cooked meal, wood smoke, and damp leather turning dry. You sit in the amber half-light and understand that survival tonight is not one dramatic act. It is 100 small acts arranged around this fire, each one ordinary, each one essential, each one keeping warmth alive in a Mississippi winter. By the time the room settles into its late evening rhythm, you become aware of clothing in a new way. Not fashion, certainly not comfort in any luxurious sense, but clothing as a second shelter. Every layer matters now, every seam, every patch, every loosened thread becomes part of the argument against the cold. You feel it in your own sleeves, in the weight at your shoulders, in the roughness at your wrists where the cloth is stiffened from wear and washing and drying too close to smoke. The fabric against your skin is coarse. It rubs rather than rests. Cotton shirting, perhaps, or a wool blend if luck has been unusually generous, though coarse wool can itch like a personal grievance. The weave is sturdy more than soft. It holds body heat better after you have sat near the hearth for a while, but when first pulled on in a cold room, it can feel like a reluctant friend. Many enslaved people in the Deep South were issued simple garments by plantation owners, often 1 or 2 sets for the season, with quality depending on budget, local practice, and the owner's version of conscience, which was often quite thin. Men might receive shirts and trousers from coarse woolens or cottons, while women often received dresses, shifts, headcloths, and occasional outer wraps. Children got the shortest end of almost every arrangement. You glance around and see the same truth written in every garment. A shirt has been patched at both elbows with fabric that does not quite match. A dress bears a careful mend along the side seam, where it must have torn during work. A shawl has thinned at the fold but is still wrapped close, still doing its duty. One older man wears a coat that may once have belonged to someone else, its shape a little wrong for him, its cuffs turned back to fit his arms better. Cast-off clothing travelled downward through households and plantations in strange and silent routes. A garment could begin its life in one world and end it in another, carrying neither dignity nor shame on its own, only usefulness. The cabin is warmest close to the fire, but that warmth does not travel far enough to make heavy clothing unnecessary. Instead, people adjust. A sleeve is pulled over a hand, a headscarf is retied to cover the ears more fully. A child is tucked deeper into an older person's side, a blanket is wrapped around shoulders while supper is eaten. The body becomes a site of strategy. You cover the wrists because warmth leaks there. You guard the feet because once they turn cold, the whole body seems to follow. You keep your neck covered because drafts are cunning and know how to find skin. Blankets lie folded nearby. and as someone lifts one you see at once how thin it really is. From a distance it looks serviceable. In the hand it tells the truth. The weave is worn. The surface is roughened into little pills. Some spots are almost translucent where years of use have worried the fibres apart. Yet it still has weight. And in a winter cabin weight counts for a great deal. Another blanket has been pieced together from several lengths of cloth, stitched with practical care. One section is striped, another is plain. One patch is noticeably softer than the rest, perhaps cut from an older garment. It has the look of an object that has refused retirement for purely stubborn reasons. Blankets issued to enslaved people were often few and far from luxurious. Plantation records sometimes mention annual distributions of 1 or 2 blankets per person. But those records flatter reality by pretending issue and condition were the same thing. A blanket given new in 1 year did not remain new through nights of smoke, damp, children, washing, repairs, and endless use. Formerly enslaved people later described winter bedding that was insufficient, shared, patched, or supplemented by whatever else could be found. Historians continue to debate how typical the worst recollections were from region to region, since the archive is uneven, and plantation owners loved neat inventories more than messy truths. What is certain is that warmth at night depended on more than official provisions. The sleeping places begin to take on their own presence as the hour grows later. A rope bed in one corner sags with the softened middle that comes from long use. A pallet rolled against the wall waits to be spread near the warmer side of the room. A pile of corn shuck bedding rustles when moved, making that dry, whispering sound like many hands brushing paper. There may be straw beneath some coverings, extra cloth beneath others, whatever could lift a body a little from the chill of floorboards or packed earth. No one here expects softness in the grand sense. The goal is less ambitious and much more urgent. You want insulation, you want dryness, you want enough layers between skin and winter that sleep can happen before dawn calls everyone back. The touch of the bedding is mixed. One cover is scratchy and warm, another is smooth in spots where countless hands and shoulders have worn it down. The mattress gives a little beneath pressure, then resists with a faint crackle. If you press your palm into it, you feel the unevenness of the filling. Some parts are fuller, some nearly flat. Someone has likely shaken and redistributed it many times in an effort to keep it useful. Household labour in the quarters included constant maintenance of these ordinary things, and women often carried the largest share of that burden, though every member of a household could be drawn into it. What sleep required first had to be prepared. A small child, already half asleep, is gathered up and wrapped in extra cloth before being placed near the warmest safe spot. The action is swift and practiced, head covered, feet tucked, blanket drawn in close at the sides. Children lost heat quickly, and winter made their needs impossible to ignore. On many plantations, young children might wear very little in warm months, sometimes only a long shirt, but colder weather demanded more layering if any extra cloth existed to give them. That could mean miniature versions of worn-out adult garments, cut down and resewn, or blankets shared by several small bodies at once. There is no romance in this, only ingenuity working against exposure. You notice too how people prepare themselves for sleep before sleep actually begins. Shoes are set within reach, not because anyone expects comfort at dawn, but because cold mornings punish delay. Damp garments are hung where they may finish drying overnight. Head coverings are loosened but not always removed. Some people sleep partly dressed in winter, because undressing would only mean fighting frozen cloth in the dark before morning labour. The line between day wear and night wear blurs completely. A shirt worn in the field may become a sleeping shirt by default, then a work shirt again before sunrise. The body never gets a truly separate life from labour. There is a scholarly uncertainty here that hangs quietly over the evidence. Historians still argue over how much bedding and winter clothing varied across Mississippi plantations in the 1840s, because sources come from ledgers, travellers, slave narratives remembered later, and occasional plantation rules, all of which distort in different ways. Wealthier plantations may have issued more cloth or blankets, while others did the bare minimum or less. Seasonal timing also mattered. An owner might distribute winter garments late grudgingly, or not replace what had already worn through. The cold, meanwhile, kept no records and offered no exemptions. As the fire settles lower, body heat becomes more important. This is one of those simple facts that every winter household understands without ceremony. People sleeping close together stay warmer. Families bunch near each other. Children sleep pressed against adults or siblings. Blankets trap shared heat more effectively than solitary dignity ever could. In slave quarters, crowded sleeping was often necessary for reasons of space, but winter turned necessity into practical wisdom. You feel this in the air itself. One sleeping body warms a little pocket. Several make a climate. That closeness changes the emotional texture of the room as well. A hand smooths a child's blanket without a word. Someone shifts to make room at the edge of a pallet. An older woman checks the knots of a head wrap before lying down. A man rubs his hands together and then places them under his arms, saving warmth where he can. These gestures are unannounced and almost invisible unless you watch closely. They carry more tenderness than the official world outside the cabin would ever admit existed here. There is something almost ceremonial about pulling a blanket up in a cold room. The fabric drags over the knees, settles across the hips, rises to the chest, and at once the body begins testing whether it will hold. Air trapped inside warms by degrees. The cloth smells of smoke and skin and old soap. It scratches the chin a little. It weighs reassuringly on the legs. You curl slightly without deciding to. Human beings are built for this instinctive folding inward. Winter persuades us into smaller shapes. One fringe detail from rural 19th century life appears in scattered recollections and makes perfect sense here. Heated bricks or stones were sometimes wrapped and placed near bedding to warm it before sleep. Though such luxuries depended on access, time, and the risk of burning cloth. Whether this was common in slave quarters is uncertain, but the idea itself reveals a broader truth. People used every possible method to steal comfort from cold nights. Nothing was too small to matter if it made the body less miserable. The room's smell changes again as bedding is shaken out. Dust rises. Dry straw and corn shucks release a faint grassy note under the smoke. Warm fabric carries the scent of bodies close to the fire. Somewhere there is a trace of lye soap, sharp but clean, hanging on one garment that must have been washed recently. Your own skin begins to feel warmer beneath the layers, though your nose still catches the chill whenever you breathe near the edge of the blanket. One side of your face is in warmth. The other remains aware of winter. Such is the diplomacy of a small cabin. A child murmurs in sleep before fully settling. Someone answers with a hushed sound that is not quite a word and not quite a song. The adults speak more softly now, partly from habit, partly because the room has entered a different hour. The clothing that hung drying by the hearth has been brought closer or laid ready for morning. The blankets have moved from folded objects to inhabited warmth. The whole cabin looks softer, though its roughness has not changed. Firelight on layered cloth can do that. It makes even coarse things seem kind for a moment. You think then about what warmth really means here. Not comfort in the broad cheerful sense, not ease, and certainly not abundance. Warmth is assembled piece by piece. It is made from worn fabric, from mended blankets, from bodies tucked close, from practical knowledge passed hand to hand. It depends on who remembers to dry the stockings, who checks the child's feet, who saves the least torn blanket for the coldest sleeper, who knows where the draught enters and how to block it. The night clothing of this room is not separate from the life of the room. It is the life of the room, turned inward and wrapped close. Outside, the snow still lies over Mississippi ground, pale and strange. Inside, coarse cloth rasps softly as people settle under blankets that have outlived every reasonable expectation. The fire lowers, the room draws in, heat gathers under layers of fabric and skin. Sleep approaches dressed in wool, cotton, smoke, and shared breath. Supper has taken the sharpest edge off the cold, and now the cabin changes character. It is no longer a place arranged around hunger and heat alone. It becomes, for this part of the evening, a room shaped by voices. Bowls have been scraped clean enough to count as finished. A spoon rests against the inside of the iron pot with a small dull note. Someone wipes a child's mouth with the corner of a cloth. The fire has lowered into a steadier glow, and in that softer light people begin speaking in the unhurried way they can only manage when the most urgent tasks are done. The first sounds are practical. A question about wood for tomorrow, a remark about the water bucket icing at the rim, a muttered opinion that the air smells like more snow, though whether that is skill or guesswork no one says. Then the tone shifts. A joke appears, dry and quick, offered almost sideways. It's about a rooster too foolish to understand winter, or a mule too stubborn to slip properly, or some small mishap from the yard exaggerated just enough to earn a quiet laugh. The exact subject hardly matters. What matters is the room's response. Smiles spread without fanfare. A child giggles too loudly and gets shushed, though not very sternly. For a moment the whole cabin feels warmer by means entirely separate from fire. Humour in a place like this is precise work. It cannot be too loud. It cannot be too reckless. It must travel lightly enough to avoid trouble and yet land firmly enough to give relief. Many narratives from enslaved people describe wit, teasing, mimicry, and storytelling as important parts of daily social life, though the records only catch fragments. The jokes themselves often vanished, because humour does not preserve neatly on paper. Tone disappears, timing dies. The look on someone's face is lost. Still, enough remains to show that laughter was never absent from the quarters. It survived where it was needed most. A woman seated near the hearth tilts her head and imitates, with very little movement, the pompous manner of some white figure on the plantation. Perhaps an overseer, perhaps a mistress, perhaps a visiting man who carried his importance like a lantern. She does not name the person directly. She does not need to. Her voice shifts just enough. Her chin lifts. Her mouth tightens into that little purse of self-regard familiar to everyone present. The room responds at once with a lowered eyes, pressed lips, shoulders shaking. It is dangerous and delightful in equal measure. Gentle mockery creates a pocket of freedom too small for the outside world to notice, but large enough for everyone inside to breathe in. Then someone else adds a line. A child repeats it badly and causes another ripple of laughter. The older people look amused despite themselves. You can sense how communal memory works here. Stories are not always told from the beginning. Sometimes they're tossed into the room in pieces because everyone already knows the rest. The fire gives a soft collapse as one charred section of log settles inward. Red light brightens briefly under the ash. Faces glow and fade. The room smells of wood smoke, cooling food, damp wool nearly dried, and that lived-in sweetness created by warm breath in a small space. Outside, the night presses against the walls, but inside the voices make their own weather. One man begins a tale that sounds at first like pure fact. He says he knew a fox once that learned how to steal from a henyard without leaving tracks in new snow. This receives immediate skepticism, which appears to please him. He continues anyway. The fox, in his telling, moved like a preacher avoiding a debt, all innocence above and all planning below. Someone snorts. Someone else says a fox with manners would still be a fox. The story grows. The animal becomes cleverer, the dog slower, the owner more ridiculous. You realize the point is not whether the fox existed exactly as described. The point is the pleasure of watching cunning outpace power. Such tales mattered. Animal stories, trickster stories, exaggerated local incidents, and family recollections all moved through enslaved communities as entertainment, commentary, and coded social teaching. In the South, these traditions overlapped with African storytelling inheritances, Christian narrative forms, local rural folklore, and plain human invention. Folklorists later collected some versions, but much was surely lost or softened in the process. Historians still disagree about how directly specific tales can be traced to particular African origins, because the cultural threads were braided over generations under forced migration and slavery. Yet the deeper truth is clear enough. Stories carried knowledge, humour, warning, and style across difficult conditions. A child, newly bold, asks for a frightening story and is denied one in the same breath that grants a smaller, safer thrill. An older woman begins speaking of a strange sound heard once in the cane brakes on a winter night. Not a ghost exactly. She does not say ghost. just a cry that did not belong to any bird she knew and did not sound like any fox either. The children lean in at once. The adults pretend skepticism with varying success. She lets the mystery hang. Then, at the very point when fear might grow serious, she undercuts it with a practical ending. It turned out, she says, to be a creature far more foolish than frightening. Maybe an owl, maybe a half-frozen hog, maybe some poor man trying not to be noticed and failing at both. The room laughs again. Fear has been invited in, made to sit down, and then politely shown out. Near the doorway, two women trade remarks while mending a torn seam by firelight. Their fingers move with that astonishing confidence people develop when they have sewn in poor light for years. Stitch, pull, bite the thread, smooth the cloth. One comments that winter reveals every weakness a garment has tried to hide. The other replies that winter does the same for people. That line hangs in the room for a moment. Half joke, half truth. No one rushes to answer it. You listen to the speech patterns around you. They are quick in places, musical in others, layered with local phrasing, biblical echoes, rural sayings, and the verbal play of people who know language is one of the few resources that multiplies when shared. Some phrases come wrapped in humour, others arrive with the quiet weight of proverb. A woman says cold weather will tell on a lazy chimney. A man says hunger can hear a pot before a person can. A child repeats the second line immediately because it pleases the ear. Even speech has texture here. It crackles, curls, settles, and warms. Then comes a quieter turn. Someone begins remembering a person not present. A mother on another plantation. A brother hired out. Child sold away. The room does not freeze, but it changes. Voices lower. Eyes go to the fire. The names are spoken plainly, without performance. This is not an evening for dramatic grief. It is something else, more intimate and more durable. Memory takes its seat by the hearth as naturally as anyone. Enslaved families were constantly threatened by separation through sale, hiring out, inheritance, debt, and movement between plantations. That fact shaped evening talk just as surely as the weather shaped the walls. Names spoken aloud helped keep absent people within the life of the room. One woman recalls the smell of rice cooking from a place farther east, a smell she says could fill a whole yard before dawn. Another remembers someone who sang while shelling peas, and somehow made the peas sound better than they tasted. A man says his uncle could mend any broken handle with nothing but patience and insult. There is laughter at that. Then silence again, but not an empty silence. More like a space where everyone is allowing the absent to remain for a while. A boy, half sleepy and half curious, asks whether snow falls the same in every place. The question drifts through the room with a strange dignity. It is the kind of child's question that cracks open something larger than itself. An older voice answers that snow looks different depending on where you stand when it arrives. Another says cold is one thing in an open field and another beside people. That answer seems to satisfy him, though perhaps not completely. It satisfies you more. Some evenings in the quarters likely included singing, though not every night and not always in full voice. Tonight the room stays mostly in speech, but someone hums a few notes while folding cloth, and the tune hovers low under the talk. Spirituals, work songs, lullabies, and improvised melodies all formed part of the sound world of enslaved communities. The exact boundary between song and prayer and memory was often soft. A line could begin as one and end as another. Scholars continue to debate how much specific musical structure can be reconstructed from early accounts. Because notation was rare, and outside observers misunderstood what they heard. Yet even without certainty on form, the emotional function is unmistakable. Music held people together when words alone grew thin. A quirky little tidbit survives in a few 19th century recollections from southern rural life. Some people believed that certain kinds of weather sharpened storytelling itself, as though cold air made both memory and imagination keener. That may not be a scientific finding destined for the academy, but it feels plausible in this room. Winter narrows the world. It brings people close. It turns the cabin into a chamber where even a small tale acquires extra depth. The children begin to droop more noticeably now. One fights sleep with noble failure. blinking hard and then staring into the fire as if concentration alone can keep the eyes open. Another curls into a blanket and continues listening, despite having already crossed halfway into dreams. The adults do not stop talking, but their voices soften around the children, dropping into tones that can travel without disturbing the room's delicate calm. You realise that the stories told here are doing several things at once. They pass time, certainly. They entertain. They mock the powerful without naming them too boldly. They teach children how wit works and when silence is wise. They keep absent loved ones alive in sound. They let fear approach and then tame it. They preserve sayings, habits, weather lore, memories of places, fragments of belief. They also create pleasure, which should never be treated as a luxury too trivial for history. Pleasure was part of survival. A good laugh in a hard life is not decorative, it is structural. The hearth has dropped to a redder glow now, with occasional flickers rising where a coal splits open. Shadows on the wall stretch taller. The smell of supper has nearly faded into the deeper smell of ash and warm fabric. Someone gives the final line of a story with perfect timing, and the room answers in that low, tired laughter which belongs only to evening. It is the sound of people worn out but not emptied. For this hour, inside these patched walls, voices have built another kind of shelter, one made of wit, memory, and the brief bright comfort of hearing each other still here. As the evening deepens, you begin to notice how every age in the cabin has its own kind of work. Winter does not excuse anyone entirely. It only changes the shape of what must be done. The smallest children are the nearest thing to being free from duty, and even they are part of the room's labour simply by needing care, watching closely, and learning how a household holds together when the cold presses in. Everyone else moves within a chain of tasks so familiar that hardly anyone speaks them aloud. An older woman sits nearest the best light, her hands busy with a garment spread across her lap. The fabric is too worn to deserve the name sturdy, yet she handles it with the confidence of someone who has argued with cloth all her life and won most of the important battles. Her needle catches the firelight, flashing once, then disappearing into the dimness again. Pull, smooth, turn, knot. Her fingers are broad at the joints and marked by work, but they still move with a patient delicacy that the room depends on. Winter repairs cannot wait for daylight. A seam that opens tonight becomes a draft tomorrow. A missing button can mean cold fingers fumbling before dawn. Domestic labour often hides inside history under the plainest words, but in truth it is a kind of engineering. Beside her, a younger woman folds blankets and sorts the bedding with quiet efficiency. She knows which cover has the fewest holes, which one still holds the most warmth, which pallet needs shaking out, which child must be wrapped twice because that child always wriggles free in sleep. None of this appears in plantation ledgers. No owner ever wrote. One woman remembered exactly who kicked off the blanket after midnight, yet this knowledge kept families alive and rested enough to face another day. A boy who is perhaps old enough for harder work and young enough to resent being told so, kneels near the hearth and nudges the woodpile into better order. He separates thicker sticks from kindling, stacking them by size with that mixture of competence and reluctance common to boys everywhere. Now and then he glances toward the adults to see whether anyone has noticed how useful he is being. Someone has. No praise is offered immediately. Praise, to many households, is given like seasoning. Too much, and people begin expecting luxury. Still, after a while an older man tells him not to bury the best kindling under the heavy wood like a fool, and the correction carries a certain rough affection. Children in enslaved households often took on responsibilities early, whether minding younger siblings, carrying water, gathering chips for the fire, scaring birds from fields, twisting thread, or helping with food preparation. The exact duties varied with age, plantation routines, and family circumstance. Historians still argue over how sharply childhood was divided from adult labour in different enslaved communities, since some evidence emphasises play and attachment while other records underline constant work. Both can be true. Childhood existed. So did burden. They often shared the same pair of small hands. Near the far wall, a little girl is charged with a task just important enough to make her serious. She must keep a younger child occupied and out of the way while the bedding is laid down. She does this by rubbing the child's hands between her own and whispering some private nonsense that sounds half song and half instruction. The younger one stares up at her with solemn eyes, then laughs for no visible reason. The laugh is tiny and sudden. It flutters through the room like a bird startled from straw. An elderly man sits with his back to the wall, boots off, rubbing one ankle through the fabric of his stocking. The movement is slow and firm, like someone trying to persuade the ache to travel elsewhere. Age in the quarters did not mean retirement in any modern sense. Older enslaved people often continued labouring as long as their bodies could be made to serve, though duties might change if strength failed. Some became especially important in childcare, nursing, household guidance, gardening, or the passing on of skills that could not be learned from a ledger. The room seems to orient itself around this man in small ways. Children do not climb on him tonight because they can tell he hurts. One of the women passes him a warmer cloth for the ankle without needing to ask. Such exchanges say more than speech. The cabin smells different now than it did at supper. Food has settled into the background. In its place, you catch the scent of warmed cloth, ash, tired skin, and the faint medicinal sharpness of something rubbed into sore joints. Maybe grease, maybe herbs steeped in fat, maybe camphor if anyone has come by such a thing, though that would not be common. Folk remedies circulated widely in enslaved communities, blending African knowledge, native botanical understanding, European household cures, and whatever local experience proved useful. People used poultices, teas, heated cloths, salves, and whispered advice handed down through generations. A great deal of this knowledge was practical, experimental, and deeply local. A great deal of it was also ignored or dismissed by those with the power to write official accounts. A middle-aged woman now checks the embers with a practised eye. She leans forward, lifts one charred piece with a stick, and studies the coals beneath as if reading a message only she can see. Then she adds a smaller piece of wood, not enough to make the flames leap, only enough to keep the fire honest for a little longer. Fire tending itself often fell to whoever stayed wakeful longest, or rose earliest. Though duties could shift within the household, on nights like this, the difference between a living bed of coals and a dead hearth by morning was no small matter. To wake in complete cold meant extra time, extra fuel, and extra misery. A curious piece of rural winter lore survives in scattered recollections from the 19th century. Some households judged the coming weather by how a fire behaved, if smoke hugged low, if the wood snapped sharply, if the chimney drew in a certain stubborn way. People claimed snow or frost was near. Not all such lore was reliable, but it offered a sense of conversation with the elements. In a place where weather could shape labour, health, and sleep. Even half-trusted signs were worth noticing. On a stool by the hearth, another older woman has taken a child's foot into her lap. The child protests weakly, not from pain but from fatigue. She checks the sole, the heel, the toes, feeling for dampness, tenderness, or the first signs of skin rubbed raw. Good sense in winter begins at the feet. She mutters that the child would lose both toes and wits if left to manage alone, then wraps the foot more firmly before slipping it under the blanket. The child pouts for a moment, then yields. Here care often arrives disguised as complaint. You realise that the evening chores do not happen in a straight line. They overlap, interlock, double back. Someone folding cloth also listens for the kettle. Someone mending a seam also watches the children. Someone soothing sore limbs also remembers to move the shoes farther from the heat. Labour inside the cabin is communal, but not in any neat or sentimental sense. It is messy, interrupted, adjusted by need and temper and tiredness. A child drops something. A needle is lost and found. A coal shifts. Someone sneezes. Someone laughs softly at the sneeze. The room continues. One boy tries to escape his part of the work by pretending to be far sleepier than he is. His eyelids droop in a performance that would impress no one on earth. An elder tells him that a truly sleepy child does not watch everyone else from under the blanket. The room gives a small hum of amusement, caught neatly. He grins and resumes twisting a strip of cloth that may be used tomorrow as a tie, a patch, or some other humble necessity? Small evasions like this must have been common in every cramped winter household. Even under enormous injustice, ordinary family comedy survives. A child is still a child. The elders carry more than task knowledge. They hold the room's memory of how to do things properly when conditions are poor, how close to place the shoes by the hearth without cracking the leather, which blanket should lie underneath because it is too thin to trap air on top, how to wrap a coughing child so the chest stays warm, how to bank the coals, how to stretch laird, meal, or soap, how to tell from a person's face whether that person is merely tired or truly coming down sick. This kind of expertise is rarely honoured by the wider world, yet entire households lean on it without ceremony. Some enslaved elders also served as midwives, healers, religious guides, and keepers of family history within their communities. Their authority was not always formal and not always safe from disruption. Especially under a system that split families and denied stability, still, older people often became essential centres of continuity. Scholars continue to debate how much social power elders could maintain under different plantation regimes. Because violence and forced dependency distorted every relationship, even so, age could carry knowledge that no overseer could manufacture and no ledger could fully erase. The younger children are softer now, almost boneless with sleep. One leans against a rolled blanket and blinks at the fire as if the coals are speaking directly to him. Another has begun that heavy breathing that signals the final surrender. A teenage girl lifts the smaller child gently and lays him down with more care than the moment seems to require, adjusting the blanket edge twice, then once more. You suspect she has done this many nights, and will do it many more. Her movements are economical, but there is tenderness in the economy itself. At the edge of the room, the older man with the aching ankle has begun speaking quietly to the boy by the woodpile. It is not a full story, more like instruction braided with memory. He explains which wood catches fastest, which burns longest, which smokes too much when green, and how to tell by the feel of bark whether a stick is worth bringing in from the yard. The boy listens with exaggerated patience, which is to say genuine attention disguised as boredom. Knowledge passes best that way sometimes. No grand speech, just a few sentences beside the fire while the room settles towards sleep. The sounds now are wonderfully small. Needle through cloth, a child sighing, the hush of a blanket shaken once and laid flat, the low scrape of a stool moved 2 inches, the faint wheeze of the chimney as wind tests it from outside. You can hear the breathing of different people fall into different rhythms, some quick, some deep, some tired in the bones. Every sound feels domestic, intimate, and slightly fragile. What stays with you most is how much winter survival depends on people noticing one another, not grand gestures, not speeches of devotion, not anything fit for a monument. Instead, one person sees the child's cold feet, another hears the cough before it worsens, another remembers where the driest blanket lies, another checks the coals, another keeps a sore ankle warm, another teaches a boy the difference between useful wood and dead weight. The cabin is full of these modest acts, and together they create something larger than comfort. They create continuity. Outside, the strange Mississippi snow remains on the ground, pale beneath the dark. Inside, elders and children complete the final chores of the evening, under a roof that holds because they keep holding it. The room softens. Tasks are finished or left waiting until dawn. Hands go still one by one. The fire lowers to a thoughtful glow. Care has moved through the cabin like quiet light, touching every age before settling into the hush of night. At some point the talking thins out and the cabin begins to listen. That is the strange turn winter nights often take. While people are busy, the room belongs to hands and voices and fire. Once bodies settle and blankets stop shifting, the sounds outside begin to press their way inward. You lie still and hear the world beyond the door as if it has moved closer to the walls. The cabin is not silent. It breathes, cracks, sighs, and answers the wind in its own wooden language. But the night beyond it now feels larger, colder, and oddly alert. The first thing you notice is the wind. It does not blow in one steady stream. It comes in slow testing passes, feeling along the cabin sides, slipping at the roofline, moving around the chimney as though searching for a weakness. When it finds a seam in the boards or a gap near the shutter, it draws out a small sound, almost like a whistle cut short. Then it moves on. A stronger gust makes the whole structure respond with a faint shudder. Not enough to frighten anyone awake, but enough to remind you that shelter is a bargain, not a certainty. Snow has a way of changing sound. Even a thin layer can soften the ground and swallow the sharper edges of the night. The usual noises of yard and road are dulled. Hoof beats, if any pass at a distance, seem cushioned. Footsteps come strange and muffled. The fields themselves appear to be holding their breath. Mississippi is not a place that wears snow often, and the land seems almost embarrassed by it, as though caught in borrowed clothing. From somewhere beyond the quarters comes the low complaint of livestock. A mule gives a short, irritated sound from a shelter or pen, the sort of grumble that suggests deep moral offence at the weather. A dog answers with 2 barks and then decides the matter is not worth pursuing. Animals react to winter with admirable honesty. No philosophy, no dignity, just protest. The dog settles again. The mule remains unconvinced by the entire season. You shift beneath the blanket and feel the warm pocket your body has made. The air outside the covering touches your face with immediate chill, so you draw the edge closer under your chin. Around you, other people sleep, or nearly sleep, and their breathing gathers into a low, uneven chorus. One person snores softly, then stops. A child lets out a little sigh through the nose. Someone coughs once and turns over, making the corn shuck mattress whisper. These indoor sounds are intimate and human. Outside, the noises carry distance. Now you hear something firmer. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, somewhere in the yard. Not close enough to rattle the latch. Not far enough to ignore. You listen harder. The steps press into frozen ground and crusted snow with a faint crunch. Pause, then continue. Perhaps it is someone moving between cabins. Perhaps a man checking on an animal. Perhaps one of the patrols or a white watchman crossing the property. Night on a plantation never belonged entirely to the people trying to sleep. That is the bitter fact beneath every quieter detail. Even after the day's labour ended, surveillance and interruption were always possible. The sounds pass and do not return. Still, they leave attention behind. You become more aware of the walls, the door, the smallness of the room. Enslaved people in the South lived under constant threat of control, punishment, and intrusion, and nighttime offered no complete safety. Patrols, overseers, owners, and hired men could appear without kindness or warning. Historians still argue over how frequently night movement within the quarters was monitored on different plantations, because practice varied and records distort toward the viewpoint of those who held power. What is clear is that the darkness offered both shelter and risk. It could conceal a private meeting or expose a person to danger. Both truths lived side by side. The fire, banked low now, adds its own quiet remarks. Coals settle with a powdery hush. A buried spark brightens red, then dims under ash. Every so often one small piece of wood shifts inward, and the sound is startling in the stillness. Louder than it should be. You smell cooling smoke, dry clay, warm blankets, and that faint mineral note of old ash. The chimney draws in a long muted pull, as if the cabin itself is breathing through brick and soot. Beyond the yard, there is the far cry of a night bird. The call lifts suddenly, thin and eerie, then fades across the dark. An owl, perhaps, or another bird made stranger by cold air and distance. In a place where the ordinary world is already shadowed by fear, even harmless sounds can acquire shape and meaning. A branch knocked against another becomes a knock at the wrong door. A fox bark in the field turns into something half ghost before sense returns. One of the small torments of night is that the ear becomes dramatic when the eye can no longer correct it. That uncertainty fed belief as much as weather did. In enslaved communities, as in many rural communities, the night carried stories with it. Some spoke of signs, warnings, spirits, and troubled places. Some distrusted crossroads. sudden cries in the dark, or dreams that came too sharply before dawn. Others laughed at such things until the wind changed and the chimney moaned in just the wrong tone. Folk belief was not a simple matter of superstition. It offered ways of reading danger, grief, luck, and mystery in a world that often refused plain explanations. Scholars continue to debate how particular spiritual beliefs in the 19th century South blended African traditions, Christian teaching, and local rural customs, because those layers were constantly mixing under pressure. Yet no one who studies the period seriously doubts that the unseen world felt very near on nights like this. A child stirs beside you or somewhere near and murmurs in sleep. An older hand responds at once, touching the blanket, smoothing, reassuring without fully waking. Then stillness returns. You lie listening again. From outside comes a sharper sound, quick and startling, a crack, not a gunshot. Wood, perhaps, made brittle by frost, maybe a tree limb giving way under ice or cold. For a second, your whole body tightens anyway. The cabin seems to tighten with you. Then the night remains otherwise unchanged, and your breathing slowly eases. Winter does this to the nerves. It sharpens them, and then leaves them nowhere to go. The shuttered window admits almost no light, yet enough of the snow's reflected brightness leaks around its edges to remind you that the ground outside is pale. Snowlight is different from moonlight. It seems to rise from below rather than fall from above. It gives the world an odd upward glow inside the cabin. That faint spill of whiteness touches the floor near the wall and makes the darkness there less complete. You can imagine the yard without seeing it fully. Fence rails dusted over, bare branches silvered, paths stamped down between cabins, the well curb rimmed with frost, the privy a black shape at the edge of white ground. Beautiful, in a way that does not ask anyone's permission. Beauty can be very inconsiderate. There is a soft noise at the far side of the room. A woman has risen just enough to check the fire or adjust a covering, moving with the care of someone who knows every board that creaks. Her feet find the floor lightly. The blanket slips from her shoulders and then is drawn back again. She leans over the hearth, nudges the ash, waits, then returns to her place. The entire journey takes less than a minute, and yet it changes the room. A tiny orange pulse wakes inside the coals. The air near the hearth seems warmer already. This too is part of night sound, quiet care moving through darkness. A curious and rather charming tidbit appears in some old weather lore from the rural South. People sometimes said that snow made ordinary sounds travel oddly, while swallowing others whole. A wagon might seem farther away than it was, while a dog bark might come sharp as if just beyond the fence. Whether this was meteorology or plain observation dressed up as folklore hardly matters. Lying here, it feels true. The night is both muted and magnified. Then there are the sounds from other cabins. Very faint. A baby crying and being soothed. A low murmur of adult voices not yet gone to sleep. A laugh that escapes and is quickly reduced to hush. Somewhere a cough continues longer than you would like. The quarters are not one room, but on a night like this they feel linked by sound. Each cabin holds its own small circle of warmth, worry, and weariness. The snow outside lies over them all as if trying to make the whole place look quiet. It is quiet only on the surface. Somewhere much farther off, perhaps from the big house, perhaps from another outbuilding, a door slams. The sound arrives hard and flat, stripped of detail by distance. It reminds you that the plantation is layered with other interiors, other fires, other beds, other kinds of sleep. The contrast requires no speech. It sits there in the dark by itself. Your own body now notices every sensation more clearly because movement has ceased. The rough blanket against your neck, the cooler patch near your feet, the way your shoulder begins to ache if you lie too long on one side, the delicious heat trapped where another body is close under the coverings, the smell of smoke in your hair, the dryness in your throat from breathing warm air touched by ash. Sleep hovers nearby, but the ear keeps watch a little longer. There is a scholarly uncertainty even in something as simple as the soundscape of the quarters. Historians can reconstruct architecture, labour schedules, rations, punishments, and weather patterns more easily than the ordinary nighttime noises people lived with. Written records rarely describe the full sensory world. They tell you a chimney existed, not how it moaned in wind. They tell you cabins were close, not how clearly one mother could hear another cabin's child cry. So part of this night must be imagined carefully from material evidence, climate, architecture, and remembered fragments. That uncertainty matters because it reminds you that the past was lived through bodies, not just facts. At last the outside noises begin to drift together rather than stand apart. Wind, a dog far off, the tiny settling of the cabin, the pull of the chimney, a branch brushing once, then stopping. None of it is friendly. None of it is exactly hostile either. It is simply the winter night continuing around the fragile pocket of human warmth inside these walls. You lie still as the Mississippi cold keeps its silent hold over the snow outside. Within the cabin, sleep moves from body to body in slow order. Beyond the door, the dark remains beautiful, watchful, and dangerous all at once. The sounds of the night do not let you forget where you are. They also make the small warmth within these walls feel more fiercely precious than ever. After a while, the cabin grows so still that thought itself seems louder. Sleep has taken some of the room, but not all of it. A few people remain in that quiet territory between waking and dreaming, where the fire is low, the blankets are warm at last, and the mind begins to move through places the body cannot. In that hour, the life of the quarters turns inward. The work of the day has loosened its grip, and something less visible begins to fill the room. You sense it first in the way people speak when they do speak. No one is trading jokes now. No one is telling a long tale. The voices that remain are softer, spaced apart, almost like embers themselves. A woman near the hearth whispers a few words that may be meant for herself alone, but the cadence sounds familiar. Prayer often lives in rhythm before it lives in grammar. Another person answers under the breath, not as part of a formal exchange, more as a habit of assent. A child, not fully asleep, repeats a final word without understanding it and then drifts off. Religion in the slave quarters took many forms, public and private, orthodox and improvised, whispered and sung. Christianity shaped much of the language of hope, suffering, deliverance, judgment, and endurance among enslaved communities in Mississippi by the mid-19th century. Biblical stories of bondage and freedom held obvious force. So did promises that the mighty would answer for what they had done. Yet belief did not arrive in blank space. It met older habits of reverence, older ways of interpreting signs, dreams, illness, luck, and the thin boundary between the living and the dead. Historians still argue over how much continuity specific African spiritual traditions retained in different places by the 1840s, because the evidence is fragmentary and often filtered through hostile observers. What remains beyond dispute is that belief in the quarters was never merely borrowed. It was remade. An older woman begins humming, not enough to disturb the sleepers, just enough to steady herself. The tune does not ask for attention. It loops in a narrow range, soft and low, like someone rocking an invisible cradle. Perhaps it is a hymn known from a white preacher's service and altered by memory. Perhaps it is a family melody carried over years and miles. Perhaps the boundary between those things has vanished completely. The sound sits under the roof like another layer of warmth. Near the wall, someone touches a small object hanging from a peg before lying down fully. In the dim light you cannot tell whether it is a scrap of cloth, a little bag, a token, or merely a habit of reaching toward the same place each night. Such motions carried meaning even when no outsider would have recognized it. Enslaved people sometimes kept small personal items that held emotional or spiritual value, though the documentary record rarely captures them unless some white observer found them strange enough to mention a shell, a bead, a bit of root, a scrap with a verse written on it, a twist of cloth tied in a certain way. Official history loves the obvious symbol. Real life often hides in pockets and corners. The air smells of ash, cooling wood, wool warmed by bodies, and the faint earthy trace of herbs from somewhere near the bedding. Perhaps someone has tucked dried leaves or roots into a bag for scent or remedy. Plant knowledge was deeply important in enslaved communities, especially where formal medical care was indifferent, delayed, or dangerous. Women and elders often knew which teas might ease a cough, which poultices could calm swelling, which roots might settle the stomach, and which remedies were best avoided despite local confidence. Some of this knowledge came from African traditions carried through generations, some from indigenous practices encountered in the American South, some from European household medicine, and much from local trial and error. The result was not a neat system, it was a living body of practical wisdom. A man lying near the centre of the room says something quiet about tomorrow, though not in the plain language of chores. He says it the way a person tests whether hope is safe to speak aloud. Maybe he mentions a meeting, a message, a plan to ask news of kin, or simply a wish that the weather hold long enough for a certain task. No one answers directly. Hope in a place like this is often shared with caution. To speak it too loudly is to invite the world to mock you. So it moves through suggestion, nods, murmured agreement, silences that mean yes. There is a special density to memory at night. You can feel it in the room as surely as heat. Someone begins recalling a mother or grandmother who had a way of praying over children when storms came. Another mentions a phrase spoken before journeys, or before planting, or when a fever broke. The details are small, but small details are exactly how inheritance survives under pressure. People denied stability become experts in carrying what can be carried. Words, tones, recipes, gestures, bits of scripture, fragments of names, warnings wrapped as sayings, a particular way of tying cloth around a baby, a particular way of thanking God without asking permission from anyone else. Dreams mattered too. Across many enslaved communities, dreams could be treated as messages, warnings, comfort, or signs, though beliefs varied widely. Some people trusted them deeply, others mocked them in daylight and listened to them more seriously after dark. The 19th century was full of dream reading, omen talk, and spiritual interpretation in both black and white communities, though not always in the same form. In the quarters, where certainty was scarce and danger frequent, dreams could become one more language for making sense of what could not be openly discussed. A small voice from under a blanket asks whether the snow means anything. It is such a childlike question that no one laughs. A pause follows. Then an elder says that weather always means something, though not always what people think. That answer seems to settle over the room like another coverlet. It gives no false promise. It leaves room for wonder. It leaves room for caution. It leaves room for the fact that meaning is sometimes something people make together when the world refuses to explain itself. The fire has gone lower still. Its light now is mostly red and breathing, a pulse rather than a flame. This changes everything. In brighter firelight, faces belong to the room. In ember light, they seem to withdraw into themselves. You cannot clearly see every expression now, but you sense the inwardness around you. Blankets rise and fall with breath. The walls hold shadows that barely move. The cabin feels almost suspended, neither fully in this world nor out of it. There is a fringe detail, curious and revealing, found in some southern accounts of enslaved life and rural folklore more generally. Certain roots, seeds, or worn objects were sometimes carried for protection, luck, or strength, not always with one fixed meaning. Later writers would call such items charms or conjure objects, often flattening complex practices into exotic labels. The truth was likely far more varied and personal. Some objects may have been deeply spiritual, others may have been family customs, habits of comfort, or simple experiments in controlling uncertainty. A little bag under a pillow might hold theology, memory, and worry all at once. A woman near the corner speaks a line from scripture in a low voice, though not as a formal recitation. It sounds more like a rope thrown across darkness. Perhaps something about rest. Perhaps something about deliverance. Perhaps a psalm remembered imperfectly, but with feeling that makes perfection irrelevant. Biblical language moved powerfully through enslaved communities because it offered narrative shape to suffering. Exodus, captivity, Babylon, wilderness, judgment, mercy, Jordan, home. These words could carry more than one meaning at once. They belong to the church, but they also belong to the night, to grief, to private endurance. And yet belief here is not only sorrowing, it also holds defiance. To say that a soul answers to God and not to a master is no small thing. To pray over a child as if that child carries sacred worth is no small thing. To speak of justice beyond the plantation is no small thing. Religion under slavery could be used by white authorities to preach obedience. Yes. But within black communities, it was also reshaped into a language of dignity, hidden criticism, collective hope, and stubborn survival. Scholars disagree on the balance from place to place, because the evidence shows both pressure and resistance. The room around you suggests no contradiction at all. People can receive one message and turn it toward another purpose. You listen to the hush between the murmured words. It is not empty. It feels occupied by thought, by memory, by the absent dead, by loved ones far away, by children sleeping close, by things hoped for and not yet seen. The Mississippi winter outside remains cold and exacting, but inside the cabin another kind of weather has formed. Call it faith if you like. Call it memory. Call it inward strength too private for larger names. It is there. One person makes the sign of the cross quickly before settling. Another presses clasped hands against the chin for a brief moment. Another simply closes the eyes and breathes out as if giving the whole day back to the dark. Belief is not uniform here. It does not march in neat lines. It flickers, returns, blends, questions, steadies. That very inconsistency feels human and therefore trustworthy. The room has its own sacred geography. The hearth where food was shared, the pallet where children lie wrapped in patched cloth, the wall where an object is hung for reasons not explained, the chest that may hold a Bible, or herbs, or both, the hands that mend, the voice that hums, the whispered words spoken into the air not because anyone outside will answer, but because someone beyond the walls of the plantation might. Your own thoughts slow as you lie in the low red glow, the smell of herbs, smoke, old wood, and warm fabric settles around you. Every sensation grows softer at the edges. The room is not free. It is not safe in any complete sense. Still, within it people have made space for the inner life, and that is no small achievement under slavery. Even here, perhaps especially here, the mind reaches beyond the visible. Outside, snow shines faintly over dark Mississippi ground. Inside, beneath blankets and beside coals nursed almost to sleep, belief moves quietly from breath to breath. No sermon announces it, no record book captures it well. Yet it remains, hidden and durable, warming the room from within. Long before the sky begins to lighten, the cabin starts to change. It does not happen all at once. No one leaps up eagerly to greet the day as if this were a wholesome painting made for a parlour wall. Morning in winter arrives like an unwelcome official. Early, grey, and impossible to argue with. The warmth gathered during the night still lingers under blankets and around banked coals, but already you can feel the room tipping toward departure. Sleep loosens its hold. Labour waits outside the door with frozen hands. The first person awake is not necessarily the one who slept best. More often it is the one whose duties begin earliest, or whose body has learned the hour so thoroughly it no longer needs kindness from rest. A woman rises from her bedding with the careful stiffness of someone trying not to wake the children yet. The blanket falls from her shoulders, and the cold finds her at once. You can see it in the way her back tightens. She stands still for a moment, gathering herself, then moves toward the hearth. The fire has held, but only just. Under a grey skin of ash, a low pulse of red remains. She kneels and breathes gently at the edge of the coals. A little glow answers, then another. She feeds it slivers of kindling saved for this purpose, not wasting the larger wood too soon. The cabin fills with that dry whisper of a fire beginning again, followed by the faintest crackle as thin sticks catch. This is morning mercy in its most realistic form. Not a bright blaze, just enough heat to keep the day from starting in complete defeat. Banking fires overnight was an old practice and a practical necessity wherever fuel was precious and dawn work was relentless. To preserve embers under ash meant less trouble in the morning, and trouble was already abundant. On plantations, enslaved people often had to manage fuel carefully, whether collecting it under supervision, cutting it when allowed, or stretching what little had been brought in the evening before. Historians still debate how strictly wood gathering was regulated from plantation to plantation, because rules on paper did not always match daily practice. The fire does not care about that debate. It only answers skill. Round the room, bodies begin to stir one by one. A child rolls over and buries the face deeper into the blanket, performing the oldest protest against mourning known to humanity. An older boy wakes suddenly, as if surfacing from a dream into duty all at once. An elderly man sits up more slowly and works his jaw before speaking, testing the stiffness in his neck and shoulders. Someone coughs, a rough dry sound made sharper by the cold air. Another person clears the throat and pulls on a garment that never really stopped being worn. The smell of the cabin changes quickly with waking. Night had its own heavy scent of warm cloth, ash, sleep, and closed air. Morning adds smoke from newly stirred coals, cold damp from the door seams, and the sharp human smell of bodies pulling themselves back into motion before they are ready. A pot is set near the rekindled heat. Water, if any was left within reach and unfrozen, may be warmed a little. If not, someone must go out soon and face the bitter air. That thought travels through the room without being spoken. You pull your own blanket closer for one selfish second before admitting that the room is moving on without you. The edge of the cloth is cool now where your hands grip it. Beneath it, trapped warmth still clings around your knees and chest. Leaving that pocket of heat feels almost absurd, like volunteering to step into trouble. But winter morning under slavery is built from absurd demands. You get up because the day will not wait, and because waiting can bring its own punishment. Clothing goes on in a practice sequence shaped by cold. Stockings first, if they are dry enough, shirt pulled close, trousers or skirt tugged into place with numb fingers, headcloth tied, shawl wrapped, shoes, stiff from yesterday. Resist the feet for a moment before yielding. Some garments still carry a little warmth from whether they were kept near the hearth. Others are cold as boards. The fabric scratches waking skin. The seams remind you where the body bends. There is no space here for vanity, only for coverage. Enslaved people on Mississippi plantations in the 1840s often began work before sunrise, especially in seasons when every usable hour mattered. Winter altered the labour calendar but did not eliminate labour. There might be fence repair, wood cutting, ditch clearing, livestock care, hauling, spinning, mending tools, processing stored crops, tending kitchens, washing, childcare, and 100 lesser tasks that plantation accounts rarely honoured with detail. The romantic imagination sometimes treats winter as rest. The historical record is less sentimental. Winter merely changed the list. Someone opens the door, and the cabin flinches. Cold air rushes in hard and immediate, carrying the smell of snow, wet earth, animal breath, and distant smoke from another chimney. The sky outside is still dark blue at best, perhaps only beginning to pale at the edges. The snow on the ground gives back a weak, eerie brightness, enough to outline the yard and the path between cabins. It is not deep, but it is stubborn. Frost catches on the threshold. The whole world looks rinsed in iron. The person at the door steps out briefly and returns with wood, or water, or simply a report from the morning. Cold, more frost than before, ice at the bucket. Maybe the animals are restless. Maybe someone saw the first line of light in the east. The news is accepted without drama. Nobody expected gentleness. A child is shaken awake with firm economy. No cruelty in it. No softness either. There's no room for a long negotiation with drowsiness. The child rises slowly, hair mussed, face swollen with sleep, and sits blankly for a moment with the blanket pulled around the waist. Then someone rubs the child's arm through the cloth to wake both body and temper. A little one begins to whimper at being moved from warm bedding and is hushed against an adult's shoulder. Winter mornings make philosophers of no one. They reduced life to direct terms: up, dress, warm hands, tend fire, move. Near the hearth, a bit of leftover food may be reheated or divided if there is any to spare. Cold cornmeal from the night before, perhaps softened near the fire, a crust, a spoonful, a swallow of something warm. Breakfast in such conditions is not leisurely, it is strategic. Anything hot feels like a defence laid inside the body before stepping into the dark yard. Some enslaved people ate before daybreak, others after early tasks had already begun. Depending on plantation routine and available food, records vary, hunger, sadly, does not. A fringe but telling detail appears in some recollections of winter labour. People sometimes warmed hands over the fire and then tucked them under arms or between layers of clothing while making ready, trying to store heat for the walk outside. It sounds almost childishly hopeful, yet everyone who has known bitter cold understands the instinct. You steal warmth in advance because the morning will take it back. The sounds of waking spread beyond the cabin now. Doors open and shut along the row of quarters. A baby cries from somewhere nearby. Men's voices are lower and shorter than last night, clipped by cold and necessity. A woman calls a child's name once, then again with more force. A rooster, absurdly committed to his profession, announces dawn as if anyone had invited him to comment. Dogs stir. Somewhere metal strikes wood. Somewhere an axe bites into something frozen. The plantation is rousing by degrees into its daily machinery. You feel the dread of the fields before you even see them. That dread is not only about cold, though the cold is enough. It is about the long stretch of demanded effort waiting beyond the cabin walls, the certainty that the body must spend itself again no matter how poorly it has recovered. Winter intensifies that feeling because warmth makes leaving feel personal. The cabin, rough and cramped as it is, has become a body of shelter during the night. To step out of it before dawn is to be expelled from the only softness available. There is scholarly uncertainty in the exact winter schedules of labour across Mississippi plantations in the 1840s. Planters left records, but those records tend to speak from above, using broad categories rather than lived hours. Former narratives and local studies suggest wide variation depending on crop, plantation size, task system versus gang labour, geography, and the temperament of those in charge. Some winter days likely began later than summer fieldwork, others did not. Weather might alter tasks without easing compulsion. What remains constant is the coercion beneath the timetable. The older man whose ankle troubled him in the evening now stands and tests his weight carefully. He does not complain aloud. Complaint would change little, and cost breath. Besides, a younger person notices the hesitation and places his shoe closer to the fire for one final moment before handing it over. There it is again, that quiet economy of care. 1 second stolen for comfort. One motion that says, I see the pain, even if the day will not acknowledge it. The woman at the hearth presses a warm cloth briefly into a child's hands. Another reties a scarf over her own hair and ears. A teenage girl lifts a smaller child onto one hip while reaching for something with the other hand. No one here moves lazily. Tired? Yes. Slow with stiffness? Yes. But not lazily. Every motion has purpose because morning punishes confusion. Then the cabin begins to empty, one by one. People pass through the door and vanish into the blue cold outside. Boots or bare feet crunching frost and thin snow, breath smoking pale in the dark. The loss of their body heat is immediate. The room feels larger and poorer with each departure. The fire still glows. The blankets lie rumpled and cooling. A bowl sits forgotten for a moment on the table. These small traces of night remain behind, like evidence from a gentler country. You step out at last and the air strikes your face so sharply it feels almost solid. The sky's beginning to soften in the east, though the sun has not yet touched the ground. The quarters stand in a row with smoke rising thin and grey. Beyond them lie the frozen paths, the outbuildings, the yard, the trees stripped bare, and farther still the fields waiting under a light cover of Mississippi snow. Beautiful, yes. Also merciless. This is how dawn comes in winter under slavery. Not with peace, not with fresh possibility, but with numb fingers fumbling at cloth, with coals coaxed back to life, with children lifted half asleep, with bodies pushed from warmth toward work before the day has even fully begun. The cabin's night heat fades behind you, the cold morning opens ahead, and the labouring world, already awake, takes you back. By the last stretch of this winter story, you understand something the snow itself cannot teach. Warmth inside the cabin was never simple luck, and it was never a gift flowing down from any generous hand above. It had to be made, it had to be guarded, it had to be renewed by people whose labour was claimed by others all day, and whose small remaining hours still belonged to necessity. That is the truth glowing at the centre of the room, steadier than the firelight itself. The warmth here comes from human hands. You see it first in the walls, though not in the boards alone. The cabin stands because people kept sealing the cracks, packing the gaps, adjusting the door, shifting the bedding, and making an unfinished structure hold one more season. The room became shelter not when it was built, but when it was continually repaired by those inside it. Clay pressed into seams, straw gathered and tucked in place, cloth wedged under the door, a broken peg replaced, a roofline watched after wind. This is architecture at its humblest and most essential. Not beauty for admiration, utility wrestled out of shortage. You see it in the fire too. Firewood does not leap politely into the hearth. Ash does not bank itself. Coals do not survive the night out of sentimental attachment to the family. Someone gathered the wood. Someone cut it. Someone carried it in. Someone knew how much to burn now and how much to save for dawn. Someone turned the damp shoes, moved the drying cloth, lifted the pot, scraped the ashes, and kept sparks from becoming disaster. Warmth in a Mississippi winter cabin was not a mood. It was a discipline. The same is true of food. That bowl of something hot passed from hand to hand did not begin in the pot. It began with rations stretched, with gardens remembered, with scraps seasoned, with ingredients saved for the coldest weather, with labour in fields and yards and kitchens. It began with judgment. How much meal tonight? How much tomorrow? Which child needs the hotter portion? Which adult must rise first? Which mouth is too quiet from weariness and should be handed a bowl sooner? Care often looks like accounting when resources are tight. Yet good care contains more than arithmetic. It notices. The cabin's warmth was also made from bodies. This sounds obvious until you sit with it. Shared blankets hold more heat than solitary sleep. A child tucked against an adult warms and is warmed. People lying near one another create a climate inside cloth and darkness. On bitter nights, the body itself becomes fuel of a tender kind. Not consumed, but offered. A shoulder turned toward a smaller sleeper. Feet pressed near another pair of feet. Hands rubbed together and then wrapped around cold fingers. A baby carried under a shawl. An elder given the warm side by the hearth. None of this appears in any plantation inventory. Yet without it, winter would have cut deeper. You think too about knowledge, because warmth was made from that as surely as from wood. Someone knew which wool leaked most when the wind shifted. Someone knew corn shucks should be shaken and turned before they moulded. Someone knew how close wool could hang to the fire without scorching. Someone knew the signs of a cough turning dangerous, or a draught finding a child's chest, or leather drying too fast and cracking at the bend. Knowledge lived in the room like another hidden flame. Passed through correction, habit, and quick instruction. Do this, not that. Move it higher. Cover the feet. Save the dry pieces. Turn the blanket. Mine the coal. It was learned by watching and repeated by doing. Much of that wisdom belonged to women, though not only women. Enslaved women often carried the heavier share of domestic labour in and around the quarters, even after field work or other plantation duties had drained them. Cooking, sewing, child tending, bedding, washing, patching, nursing, and the delicate management of comfort under hardship all fell heavily upon them. Yet men and boys also gathered wood, repaired structures, tended fires, checked tools, lifted water, and added their own practical intelligence to household survival. Children too had roles, small but real. The whole cabin was a workshop of care. Historians have spent years studying the material conditions of slave housing in the American South, measuring cabin size, construction, rations, clothing allotments, and plantation management styles. Those facts matter. They tell you the framework of deprivation, but another truth lives beneath the measurements. The enslaved did not merely endure those conditions passively, they constantly altered them where they could. They improved, decorated, patched, arranged, shared, hid, saved, traded, improvised, and humanized. Scholars still argue over the degree of autonomy possible within different plantation regimes, and they are right to argue carefully. No act of domestic skill erased slavery's violence. No warm night made the system less evil. Yet it is equally false to imagine the quarters as places without creativity, order, or agency. The room itself disproves that. A curious detail from archaeological studies of slave quarters and from scattered written recollections makes this even clearer. Objects often show repair upon repair, adaptation upon adaptation, broken ceramics drilled and mended, containers reused for new purposes, fabric turned, recut, or pieced, hearth spaces modified over time. These material traces suggest lives of constant adjustment. People made things last because replacement was uncertain, and because usefulness had to be drawn out of every object until it nearly gave up being an object at all and became pure service. There is something deeply moving in that stubborn extension of life, not only of people, but of bowls, blankets, shoes, tools, and walls. You also understand more sharply that warmth inside the cabin was not evidence of comfort bestowed by the plantation. It existed despite the plantation. That distinction matters. A planter might point to standing quarters, issued blankets, rationed meal, and say there. You see, they are provided for, but provision and care are not the same. A blanket can be counted and still be too thin. A cabin can be listed and still be drafty, crowded, unsafe, and insufficient. The living warmth of the room came from the people forced to inhabit it, from their labour layered over every inadequate provision until it became barely enough. There is a moral clarity in winter that strips certain lies bare. Cold reveals what has been neglected. It shows every weakness in a wall, every gap in clothing, every shortage in bedding, every injustice in asking tired people to make do yet again. It also reveals strength, though in a quieter way. Strength appears in the mended cuff, in the child wrapped before the elder lies down, in the ash carefully banked over coals, in the joke told to lighten a room that has no reason to be light, in the whispered prayer, in the rubbed sore ankle, in the water warmed before dawn, not heroic in the loud public sense, heroic in the domestic sense, which history too often notices last. You imagine the cabin from outside now, a low shape under a pale dusting of snow, chimney smoking faintly, darkness all around it, the plantation stretched cold and watchful beyond. To someone passing at a distance, it might appear small and powerless. Yet inside that little structure, human beings have created order from coercion, intimacy from crowding, tenderness from exhaustion, and warmth from almost nothing. That is no small feat. It is a form of making that deserves to be named clearly. The sensory world of it stays with you. Smoke in the rafters, clay dust on the seams, corn shucks whispering under cloth, the sting of cold at the door, the relief of fire on the shins, wool scratching the neck, sweet potato and ash in the same breath, a child's warm weight gone heavy with sleep, the rough grain of a cabin wall under your palm, a spoon-tapping iron, wind feeling for entry outside. All of it belongs to the truth of the room. Not romantic, not picturesque, human. You think of the people who carried that room through one night after another, through winters mild and winters sharp, through sickness, hunger, births, losses, laughter, and dawns that came too early. Their names are often missing from the broad historical record. Their exact words are mostly gone. The cadence of their voices, the private jokes, the nightly corrections, the ways they folded blankets or soothed children or tested a wall for drafts, these things rarely survive cleanly in archives. Yet the effects of such acts survive everywhere once you learn how to look. They survive in narratives, in material remains, in remembered patterns, in the simple fact that life continued inside places built to constrain it. There is scholarly uncertainty in almost every intimate detail of enslaved domestic life, and honesty requires admitting that we cannot know every Mississippi cabin, every winter arrangement, every family habit, every sound before sleep. Evidence is partial, and silence fills many corners, but uncertainty should not flatten the larger truth. Wherever the quarters stood, warmth had to be created from below. That creation required intelligence, endurance, and cooperation. Under conditions meant to deny all three, the past may blur at the edges, but the centre holds. Now the cabin seems to gather itself for rest once more. The fire is low, but sufficient. Blankets settle, breathing evens. The walls, imperfect and patched, stand through another cold night because people have taught them how. Snow outside can whiten the ground, quiet the yard, and make the plantation look almost peaceful from far away. Inside, peace is something more strenuous and more precious. It is made from labour that does not announce itself, from care that leaves few records, from hands that keep working long after the world has taken too much from them. And that is the lasting image you carry from this Mississippi winter in 1845. Not the snow by itself, not the cabin by itself, not even the fire by itself. You carry the human making of warmth, the hands that stirred, patched, lifted, wrapped, stacked, banked, soothed, and shared. The small domestic genius that turned a harsh room into temporary shelter and a winter night into something survivable, under slavery, where so much was stolen. Even this modest warmth became a quiet triumph of human will. The room darkens by degrees. The coals breathe low and red. The night outside remains cold, pale, and immense. You let your thoughts slow now. The wind no longer feels sharp from here, only distant, as if the cabin has gently drifted away from it. The rough blanket settles with a little weight across your chest and legs, and that weight begins to feel kind. Around you, the room is full of sleeping breath, steady and soft, rising and falling like a tide too quiet to hear unless you listen closely. The smoke in the rafters has thinned. The smell of ash, old wood, and warm cloth lingers in the dark, familiar now, almost soothing. The snow beyond the walls gives back a faint glow to the night. It touches the edges of the shutter, the line of the door, the floor near the wall, and then fades into shadow. No one needs to speak. No one needs to move. The fire has done enough. The hands that tended it have done enough for this night too. You rest in the small warmth they made. The cabin holds. The cold stays outside, and little by little, with the coals dimming and the room wrapped in quiet, you feel the night loosen around you, until everything turns softer, slower, farther away, and sleep comes down as gently as snow.